Welcome to Digital Literacy, a guide to using technology and journalism. It's time for us to start talking about photography here in the Digital Literacy for Journalists series, and this is something that's near and dear to my heart. We've got a couple of different goals for this section. The first is we're going to talk about the mechanics of photography, and that's going to include a discussion of some of the different types of cameras you may come across. Then we're going to go through a camera and sort of talk about the different numbers and buttons and dials that are on there. And then we'll wrap up with a discussion about what types of things you want to be shooting while you're out on an assignment. So in front of you here, we've got three different types of cameras. And we'll start over here on the left-hand side. This is what's called a digital SLR or DSLR camera. And SLR stands for a single lens reflex. And some of you have probably seen professional shooting with this. Some of you may have a camera like this. There's numerous advantages to this. Image quality tends to be much, much higher because the size of the recording device tends to be much larger. You also will have a camera that deals better in low light situations. So if you're shooting at night, dark situations, cameras like this are going to have a better level of sensitivity. You've also got a lot more flexibility with the digital SLR camera, and that flexibility comes from the ability to change lenses on them. So this has a 35mm lens on it right now, but in this system you can buy hundreds of different types of lenses. On the top you'll also see something called a hot shoe. Some of these cameras will have a flash built into them, but some of them won't. The ability to plug in an external flash, a larger, more powerful flash, is something that's fairly important, and we'll talk a little bit about flash a little later on. So we're going to move that one out of the way for the moment now because we're not going to talk too much about that. At the other end of the spectrum you have your smartphones, and smartphones are getting better and better all the time. The cameras that are on these get a little bit better. This is an iPhone here. The current iPhone is, I think, an 8-megapixel camera. Some of your other smartphones are pretty good too. The advantage with this is you've probably always got it with you, so at the very least you're always going to have a camera wherever you are on an assignment. Disadvantage is not a whole lot of control. Image quality sometimes is not the greatest out of it, and low light sensitivity isn't really good. Some of the newer ones do have a little flash built into them, and it's really just a little LED light. That's what this little thing here is. But again, it's not going to be great in low light situations. You're going to have some fairly low image quality. So that leaves us with your point and shoot types of cameras, and I've got two different ones here. This is just a basic Sony model from a couple of years ago. Most of these have sort of similar functions. You know, you've got a dial on the top, you've got a power button, you've got what's a shutter button here, you've got some numbers on the front, and I want to go through some of those numbers. Now, this is a current camera. This is made by Canon. This is the one that I personally shoot with whenever I'm wandering around sometimes. I will admit that I have more cameras than I really need. This is the S100. It's one of the recommended cameras that we have. And it's very compact. What I like about this one is the size, the image quality is really good, the functions that are built into it are really, really strong, and it's a very durable camera. It's got a sort of a metalish outer covering to it, which I think is going to hold up really, really well over time. So I want to start talking about some of the different numbers that are on here, and then we'll go through the buttons. If you look at the front of any lens, you're going to see a couple of strange numbers. The first set of numbers that you see here are 5.2-26.0 mm. And that's the focal length of the lens. And the focal length of the lens is going to determine how much of a zoom it has. So this one, if you do the math, has about a 5-to-1 zoom ratio, or a 5x zoom ratio, which is pretty good. There are some super zooms out there that will have up to a 10x or even a 15 or 20x zoom range on them. So the more zoom you have, sometimes the better, sometimes not. And usually the reason it's not is the second set of numbers that you have here. So right now you see this is a 1 to 2.0-5.9. That is what's called the aperture rating, the maximum aperture of this lens. And it pairs up with the first set of numbers. So at 5.2 millimeters, which is a fairly wide angle on this sort of a camera, you're going to be at what's called f2.0, which is a very, very wide aperture opening. Now, an aperture opening is one of the three things that's going to contribute to exposure, and we'll come back to that. But a wider aperture opening generally will allow more light to come into the camera, so it's going to be better in low light situations. Now, that 5.9 means that the opening actually goes from being very, very wide at the wide angle set, and as you zoom in, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, which lets less and less light come through. So as you zoom in on something, sometimes it gets darker, and sometimes you'll have more trouble taking pictures of things. So if you're in a very low light situation, one of the things that you can do is you can physically move yourself closer, what my good friend Woody Marshall refers to as the sneaker zoom method, and that will let you shoot at a wider angle and a wider aperture. So we'll talk a little bit more about exposure here in a couple of minutes. Across the top here, we've got some basic buttons. Your on-off button, the silver button here, this is the shutter release. And then we've got this dial that's got a whole bunch of different things on it. And right now I have it set on auto. And for the most part, you're going to want to leave your camera set on auto unless you really want to start playing around with photography and taking more control. The other modes that are in here, P, TV for time value, AV for aperture value, and M for a full manual mode. And then you've got some movie modes and things like that that are on here. For the most part today, we're going to leave this in the auto mode so that the camera is actually going to control everything that's on here. So I want to talk briefly about exposure. There are 3 different things that will control how bright or how dark your image is. The first of them is what's called ISO, and that's the sensitivity of your chip. That determines how sensitive it is to light. The lower the sensitivity of a chip, the less sensitive to light it's going to be, but the higher the image quality is going to be. If you've ever shot pictures outdoors and the colors look really great and everything's really sharp, and then you move indoors with the exact same camera and all of a sudden things start looking a little grainy and the color saturation goes away, that's because your camera is automatically adjusting the ISO. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, and most cameras you're going to leave them so that it's automatically resetting that. The second thing that's going to control your exposure is that aperture that I mentioned before, and that's the opening in the lens, how much light it's going to allow through. And the third thing is what's called the shutter speed, or the time value on the Canon cameras. And what that is, that determines how long the chip is exposed for. On older cameras, you've got a little mechanical shutter that opens and closes very, very quickly. The longer you have the shutter open, the greater the chance for blurred images. And in a little bit here, we'll take a look on the back of the camera and I'll show you how you can see what your shutter speed is going to be. But as a general rule of thumb, you want to be above 1/60th of a second. When you start falling below 1/60th of a second, you're going to run into some problems with sharpness on your cameras. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mount this camera onto a tripod, and then we're going to take a look at some of the other settings that are built into the menus. Alright, I've got my camera set up on a tripod here so that we can take a look at some of the different menu items and some of the different display options that are on here, and then we'll try and shoot a quick picture or two with this towards the end of this segment here. I've got it in the fully automatic mode, which is that green auto mode on this camera, and when you're starting out, I'd recommend starting there. It's going to give you the ability to sort of concentrate on your pictures and your story and not so much on the technical stuff. The more you learn about photography, the more you're probably going to want to switch over into some of the other modes. Let's just quickly go through the display here. In the upper left-hand corner, we've got a little battery icon. It's telling you that my battery is fully charged. When you buy a camera, I'd recommend getting a spare battery for it as well. There's nothing worse than having that moment show up right in front of you and having that thing blink red and shut your camera down. Next to that, I've got a little piece of pie with an L, and that's telling me that I am in the JPEG large super fine mode on this camera, which is going to be one of the highest quality settings that I can get on this. Some cameras are also going to give you an option for RAW images. RAW images are great if you've got a lot of time and a lot of card space. They're going to take up more card space. You're going to have to do more post-processing, but just go ahead and put it in the highest quality JPEG setting that you can get. Next to that 3961, that's telling me how many frames I have left on this card. I've got a 16 gigabyte memory card in there, which is a pretty big card for this size camera. 1920 is telling me that if I flip it into the video mode, I'm going to be in high definition and 46 minutes, 53 seconds worth of card space that's on there. The little camera icon that's got the parentheses around it, that's telling me that the image stabilization mode is on right now. And then auto and the flash mode in the lower right hand corner here, this is telling me that I've got the flash in the fully automatic mode. The other 2 icons over here are just telling me I've got a memory card in there and that the GPS is picking up a satellite. This camera has a GPS function that's built into it. So let's go into the menus real quick. I just want to talk about a couple of different things that's in here. The first one is digital zoom. As soon as you buy a camera, you're going to find that that digital zoom is turned on. Turn it off. The lens on this camera has a 5x optical zoom, which means that it's moving glass elements around to magnify the image. The digital zoom is going to let you zoom in as much as it will optically and then start cropping the image, and it's just going to destroy your image quality. Turn that one off. AF point zoom, I have that off on this, and you should go ahead and read your camera manuals so that you understand what some of this stuff is. Wind filter here. If you're shooting video and it's a little windy outside, go ahead and turn this on, but otherwise leave it off. What it's going to do is it's going to sort of cut out the lower tones that might be a little bit of wind rumble or something like that. Review, I strongly recommend that you turn this off. Most cameras default to it on. The biggest battery draw on these cameras is that screen, and so if it's automatically displaying images when you don't want it to be displaying images, that's going to kill your battery pretty quick. The rest of these things, go ahead and, like I said, read your camera manuals. I'd turn the date stamp off. That doesn't mean it's not going to keep the date in the metadata, but it's not going to show up on your images. If we come over here, format, when you're starting out with a new card, you're going to want to go in and format it. This is going to wipe out all of the images that are on there, and then after you shoot and you download and you back up your data, go ahead and reformat the card so that you can clear it out. And I recommend doing that instead of deleting individual images. File numbering, I leave on continuous, create folders, lens retract, power saving, time zone. Make sure that you set your date and time stamps on here so that your images sort of get picked up. This one allows you to do time updates based off of GPS settings and all different kinds of things like that. Units, video systems, not a whole lot of this stuff that we need to really worry about. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. Now, another way that I can get to some menu items here is to hit this function set button in the middle. And if I go up one, this is giving me a self-timer option. So I can have it off so that as soon as I take a picture, it takes push the button, it takes a picture, a 10-second delay, a 2-second delay, or continuous. Most of these cameras you're going to want to leave the aspect ratio in a 4:3. That's going to give you the highest quality. This is that JPEG setting, so I've got it at JPEG large right now, which is going to give me the highest image quality. Video settings are in there as well. And if I go ahead and I change my mode on the top from A to program, we're going to see that we actually get different options in here. And the screen gets a little bit different. So we're not going to worry too much about some of the stuff that's there on the screen, but if we hit that function set button, you'll see that we get some control over our ISO now. We get control over white balance, which will affect the color of our images if we want it. We can go into a continuous mode, so we can push the button and hold it down and it'll keep taking pictures for a little while. There's all different kinds of things in here. We can change the metering mode, we can put a neutral density filter on. This is that RAW and JPEG sorts of an idea, so that you can get both RAW images and JPEGs. You can set your JPEG quality in here, all kinds of different things that are in there. So I am going to go ahead and leave this, turn that off, in this mode, because in a moment here it's going to show us a couple of things that I want to see as well. We've also got some other buttons around here. Over here to the left I've got a little flower, and that's the macro mode. If I was shooting something that was really close to the lens, I could put it in the macro mode and be able to focus very, very closely. The display button will just let me change the display stuff that's up there if I want to. And then the flash mode, when I'm in the program, it's going to give me a couple of different options. Now, flash is wonderful and miserable at the same time. It's wonderful because if you're in a really dark situation, sometimes you don't have any options on how to make a picture without using a flash because you just don't have enough light. It's miserable because the flash that's built into most of these point-and-shoot cameras is too close to the lens. It's not very powerful. It's going to give you some really, really ugly shadows. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn off my light here and make the world go very, very dark. And I'm going to turn on my flash. Go ahead and take a picture here. And then we'll go ahead and hit the play button. And we'll see that you've got this really nasty shadow that's going on back here. And I'm really not a big fan of that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn my fake window back on here. Get that cranked up a little bit, like that. And now, if I tap my shutter lightly again, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn my flash off. And one of the things I want you to pay attention to is, and it's a little difficult to see because my finger's a little cropped out here, but on that shutter release button, instead of coming in and just jamming down on it, what I want you to do is push it down a little bit. And what that's going to do is that's going to turn the autofocus on. So if I push this a little bit, it's going to go ahead and focus, and it gives me a little green square there. See that? And now I can go ahead and take the picture. And the difference between that and that, where I've got that nasty shadow over there, pretty substantial. I think I'd much rather have that kind of a lighting situation there. So that gentle push on the shutter release is kind of important, because if you're in a lower light situation, you could end up with a place where your shutter speed is going to get kind of low. So in the program mode on this camera, when I focus down along the bottom, it's giving me my shutter speed, which is coming up at 1/40th of a second, and f3.2. On this camera, I could probably hand hold without too much of a problem there. But if I drop too far below that, I'm going to end up with images that are a little bit blurry. So if you can't get the camera to be above 1/40th, maybe 1/60th of a second, and you're going to see some strange fractions in there, then you're probably going to want to go ahead and turn the flash on. All right. So zooming in on this, once again, we can go ahead and we can zoom in on our screen. A light press will get it to focus. Once we get that green square, we know that it's focused. In the lower left-hand corner, you see how it's blinking red. That's warning me that right now I'm going to get a blurry image because the shutter speed is pretty low, down at 1/25th of a second. But since I'm on a tripod, I should be able to get that to look pretty good. So under the review mode, when I hit that play button, I can do a couple of things here on this camera. I can use that zoom control up top to zoom in and check for sharpness on an image if I wanted to. I can also go ahead and hit the display button, and it's going to give me some more information. So it's giving me the date and time. It's giving me the format that this was shot in. This is more of that shooting information, and the more you learn about photography, this is where you're going to want to go to sort of study and see what sort of choices your camera's making, because it's telling you the mode that you're in, the sensitivity. That ISO 800 is sort of that's sort of the upper end of where you'd want to be. 1/25th of a second and f5.9 on the lens there, and then some other shooting data down here. And this is what's called a histogram. And the histogram is a great way to start learning about how your exposure is going to work. The histogram is a graphical representation of exposure. It starts with the shadows on the left-hand side and then moves through midtones and then highlights on the right-hand side. When we get to Photoshop, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, a couple of quick tips on shooting with these cameras. Remember that you want to tap that shutter lightly to get it to focus, and then push it all the way down to get it to take the picture. You want to do that in a very smooth sort of a motion. You want to fill your frame as much as you can. So I'm locked down on a tripod here. So that's not too bad of a composition, but I've got a lot of dead space over here to the left and to the right on my image. So I'd probably want to go ahead and move the camera a little bit. I'm going to do this, and hopefully I'm not going to screw up my video too much, but I'm going to loosen this, and maybe I would change my composition to something like that. Now, if I do this and I press and get it to focus again, it may end up focusing on what's in the center of the frame, which could be that shadow in the background. So what I could do is, I'm going to loosen this again, point it at my subject, push the focus button, push the shutter button down so it locks focus, and then I can go ahead and I can recompose and use that grid to get an image that I like a little bit more. Once again, we can take a look at that. And that frame there, compositionally, it's a little bit nicer than some of the other ones we had where we had our subject dead center. Moving your image to the left or to the right and have it look into the frame is going to be a more dynamic composition, so it's something to think about as you're taking pictures. The big question in photography is always, where do I point the camera and when do I push the button? So let's talk about the types of things that you should be shooting or what to shoot. On every assignment that you go out on, I'm going to recommend that you shoot 4 different types of pictures. The first thing that you should look for is a portrait or even just a simple mugshot, that little half-column picture that gets stripped in to a story there. That's going to show people who it is that's involved with your story. And portraits are really important, even those little mugshots, because somebody may read a name in your story and they may not recognize the name, but if they see a photograph of the key character in your story, they may say, you know, that's somebody who I see at my favorite restaurant. That's somebody who I've walked past. That's somebody who's been in my class. So always looking for a good, clean portrait or a good, clean mugshot. I have, in various points in my career, told all of my staff photographers that they must do a mugshot of every single person that they've ever come across that is involved with the story, and that builds up a little mugshot file. Just having that little graphic element will make you really popular with page designers back in the newsroom. The second type of image that I'd always recommend getting is what we call a long shot. And a long shot is an image that's going to help establish a scene. It can give a sense of space, a sense of scale, a sense of location. Sometimes you can even get a sense of time out of it. So having a picture that's sort of a wide shot that gives you an idea of how many people are involved or the location of this will really help ground your story and give your readers an idea as to where the story is coming from. The next type of shot is what I call a medium shot, and a medium shot moves in a little bit closer. If you want to think about it compositionally, it's generally from the waist to the top of the head, and it's really heavily dependent upon moments and interactions. Medium shots should always be about relationships between people and items, things like that. So move in a little bit closer. And then the last one are what we call close-ups, and close-ups are detail shots. They're the sorts of things that we, as trained observers, are going to see that the average person might not. So the little bitty details that go into your stories and really sort of help make it pop. So combinations of portraits, long shots, medium shots, and close-ups are really handy to have. It's a nice little formula, and I'm not a really big formula kind of a person, but if you're going to be shooting, you might as well start with some sort of a baseline to work off of. And when you start building audio slideshows, having that kind of collection of images is going to make your life a whole lot easier. So remember, portraits or mugshots, or portraits and mugshots on all of your stories, long shots to set the scene, medium shots to show relationships, and then close-ups to show those little details that are going to help make a story pop. So let's go through our vocab. We started out by talking about the different types of cameras, and those types of cameras were the digital SLR or DSLR. Those are sort of the high-end cameras, give you a lot of control, will give you the ability to change lenses and plug in external flashes. Then we talked a little bit about focal length of lenses on the point-and-shoot cameras, and most of your point-and-shoot cameras you're going to have fairly small numbers because the chip size is very small. You will see that, say, on the Canon camera, the wide angle end of it was like 5 millimeters thereabouts. A wide angle lens on a digital SLR camera may be 24 millimeters, and that's just a property of optics, and you don't have to worry too much about that. The different modes on top of the camera, I'm going to recommend that most of your shooting you leave it in auto for now if you're just starting out. And you can read your camera manuals, always read your manuals, to learn what the other modes do. The aperture priority, or AV mode, will allow you to control the aperture in your camera, and then the camera will calculate the corresponding ISO and shutter speed. The shutter priority, or TV mode on some cameras, some of the cameras it's labeled as S, will allow you to dial in the shutter speed that you want, and then the camera will calculate the aperture and the ISO. And then there's a full manual mode on most of these as well. We talked a lot about flash, and flash is really important because if you use it well, like on a digital SLR camera, it can make your pictures look really great. And if you use it poorly on a point-and-shoot camera, it can really make your images look pretty bad. We talked a little bit about JPEG, which is the file format that you're probably going to want to be shooting in. The other format is a RAW format, and you may come across that on some cameras. Some have it, some don't. A RAW image on a digital camera is going to give you much more control, but it's going to take up more card space, and it's also going to make your post-processing take a lot longer. The macro mode will allow you to do close-ups. And then we talked about the 4 different types of images that you should be shooting. Portraits, which are images that give us a sense of who our main character is. Long shots, which is going to give us a sense of scale and a sense of place. Medium shots, which is where our relationships and interactions are going to come from. And close-ups, which are going to be those detail shots that add a little bit of texture, add a little bit of fabric. So here's my recommendation. I would go out and take your camera, charge up your batteries, make sure you've got a clean card in there, and shoot some pictures. Find someone to do a quick little profile on. Do a portrait of them. Look for some nice light, maybe some window light inside that will illuminate their face nicely. Give us a sense of the place that they do their work in. Show us them actually doing their work. And then maybe give us a detail of the work that they are doing. And that's going to wrap up this video on photography for digital literacy for journalists. This series was produced for the Journalism Department of the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia by a grant from the James M. Cox Institute for Newspaper Management Studies.